Boy, oh boy. Folks, it's that time of year again. I'm sure we've all felt that magical change in the atmosphere. No, it's not the latest California wildfire. Am I right, folks? It's not that. It's not the runaway greenhouse effect. Yuck, yuck. No, it is the coming of the new American school year, the end of summer, certainly by the time I've released this, the end of summer. I think for a lot of K through 12 in the American school system, school has probably been back like a week or two now. Colleges and universities haven't quite been back yet, but they will be pretty soon. And we can all feel it. Like I said, we can all feel it. It is like I said, the most magical time of the year. All those lazy teachers and kids, they're finally going to get back to work after a 3-month long vacation. Like, what the heck is that about? What the heck is that about, folks? It really is time to get these people back to work. Get them back at school. We're all vaccinated. We all have our masks now. What are they so afraid of? Get them all back in school. Get everyone back to work. And, there's so many things to love about this time. All those wonderful back-to-school discounts on, like, markers and pens, notebooks, all that stuff we love. All that wonderful 7 in the morning traffic jams on all our commutes. Getting into those metro stations, all those bus lines to get to the university. We all love it, folks. It's the smell of productivity that's in the air, the smell of learning, the smell of people becoming better citizens. That's what we're all sensing. God, I love it so much. I love school. I love education. American education system, the United States educational system, the best educational system in the world. And that's what this podcast is about. My name is Axel. I am a teacher. I am a tutor. I've taught students of all ages in a number of different topics, usually within English. What in the American school system we know as in the English subject. And it's also a podcast just generally about education as a concept in America, worldwide, how it works as a system in America, where its institutions are, local problems, or just whatever I could read about that's about education. That's what we talk about here, or even kind of like tangentially related. That's kind of what I talk about here. And so what are we going to talk about in this first little episode of this new podcast that, I don't even know what the podcast is going to be called. I don't know anything other than I just have some things I want to talk about to myself, right? How all good ideas and good enterprises start. Well, what I want to talk about is, the biggest, some would call it a problem. I wouldn't really call it that. But many of the most smart people writing about it would call it a very serious problem. And it's academic dishonesty in our schools, in K through 12, in our universities. Cheating, folks. Just the absolute scourge, the epidemic, the real epidemic, right? We had COVID, there's going to be monkeypox, but really the biggest problem is all those cheaters in our schools, in our universities, who are, they're really like criminals. They're stealing grades from other hardworking students. They're debasing, degrading, and delegitimizing our education system, our schools, as places where we go to learn and to give our best effort. As students and teachers, it's such a huge quote unquote problem. Now, I mean, I'm being sarcastic. I'm being an asshole. I'm being a sarcastic asshole. I actually don't really care about cheating. I don't think it's a problem. But what's actually true is that to the amount of people who do think it's a huge problem. And what this first podcast little episode, have no idea how long it's going to be. This introduction is probably going to be like half an hour. We'll see how the rest of it goes. There's really going to be not really a history of cheating. That would go all the way back to the dawn of education as a concept, but just a short history on how people have researched cheating, talked about cheating, and the different solutions, quote unquote solutions to cheating. Now, to me, there are some pretty simple solutions to it, but we'll get into that. And so really what this podcast, the next couple of episodes of this podcast, as far as cheating as a topic is concerned, is really the story of from the 90's into about now, post-pandemic, the post-pandemic educational environment of how people have talked about cheating, what students have thought about cheating, and as I will say later, the total defeat of every single solution other than a couple very narrow and insufficient and completely useless solutions, honestly. Solutions that don't really solve anything, as you could expect from an American institution, right? And so before I get into all that, I do just want to say, like, what do I mean when I say it's not a problem? Well, I mean exactly that. I don't care about cheating. Really, I didn't care about it when I was teaching at colleges. I didn't care about it really as a student. I don't really care now that I'm doing more like private tutoring and stuff like that. I still don't really care if my students really cheat in their regular schools. To me, I'm not bothered by it. I don't really consider it the way which you'll see a lot of the authors that we're covering this episode. I don't really consider it a moral problem at all. I don't consider it the way some other authors think of it, as like a social problem really that much at all. I don't consider it, as some other authors still would say, as like something that delegitimizes the institutions of education, our educational system. I think they delegitimize themselves without help from students cheating. And why do I think that? You might be sitting there wondering, how could you, Axel, as a teacher, as someone who has studied education for a while, presumably, who has been in education, who knows a lot of teachers, that's me, that's me saying that, because, you wouldn't know that stuff about me. Like, why would I take a position like that? Why wouldn't I care that much about cheating, right? Wouldn't, like, a student who cheated in my class, wouldn't that totally delegitimize my class? Wouldn't that completely put to waste the efforts of the students who were taking my class honestly? Wouldn't that, if they'd ever got out that students were cheating, if those honest students were looking at those students who are cheating and saw that they were successful at cheating, saw that I wasn't taking them seriously, wouldn't that destroy their experience in the classroom, whether it was in college, whether it was in tutoring, whether when I was teaching K through 12, like, isn't that just a huge, massive problem that every teacher, not just you, Axel, but that every teacher needs to take super, super seriously? And even against all those facts, even knowing other teachers, even knowing like how catching a cheater feels like to other teachers, even knowing like, how it feels to be that honest student who watches other students cheat and get away with it and being discouraged by it, in that sense, I would still take all of that. I would take all that experience, all those feelings, all those perspectives. I would still come down on my position here in this episode that I'm taking, this podcast episode, of cheating not being a big deal. Something that I really don't care about. I really don't think it's a problem really on its own. Honestly, it's for me to think about, oh my God, all those cheaters, this epidemic of cheating. I just don't think about it. I don't think about it, and to me, it's not serious. Now, why do I think that? Why do I take this position when the dominant opinion, at least going back the last 30 years, as you'll see, has been that it is so serious that we need to take every measure we can to prevent it, to persecute it, to punish it. But before I go into why I'm going against the dominant grain here in terms of my stance toward cheating, I do just want to say really quickly that when I talk about cheating, I'm really not talking about like crimes. I do just want to say that right away. So I'm not suggesting that like, you commit actual crimes, right? Don't like bribery or threatening people, threatening other students, or threatening teachers. If you're a student yourself, like don't, don't bribe or threaten your teachers or other students to get a good grade. So if you're a teacher listening to this and you see that shit, you should put a stop to it, right? Put a stop to it, call it out, go through the proper procedures, all that kind of stuff. If for no other reason than like to save yourself, like for real, like if you're thinking from just like a covering your ass standpoint, if you're a teacher and a student is bribing you for some kind of favor, like you shouldn't take that deal, because then you become a loose end. You become tied to this kid's fate. If things go south for him, for that student who bribed you, they're going to rat you out and then you're fucked. So yeah, again, cover your ass. I would say the same thing about like being threatened, right? You have a student threatening you, big problem especially for female teachers, right? Dealing with their male students. Like, don't let that shit go. Report it, clean your hands of it. I'm coming out hard against that, right? So this podcast is anti-threatening people. We're anti-bribery. I'm taking a brave, strong stance against those things for legal reasons. I'm also anti-getting sued anti getting sued because I recommended that people do crimes. So disclaimer, I am not suggesting or recommending that you do crimes, all right? You as a student, please do not do crimes. And if you do not come back to this podcast and be like, oh, I got it. Mr. Axel told me to do this. I got it from that podcast. Don't ever do that, okay? So no, I'm not talking about crimes. I'm talking about the victimless crime, quote unquote crime, of passing a class however you can without resorting to violence or financial fraud, right? Quote unquote cheating. Quote unquote academic dishonesty. So I am a cheating apologist in part because, for real, real talk. If any of you were normal students at any point of your lives, you've probably cheated. And you know why. I've cheated, and I've known why. Most of the times when I cheated, I understood why I did it. It doesn't matter how big or small the assignment was you cheated on. It doesn't matter how much you cheated on that assignment or that test, whether you only did it once or if you did it throughout the whole semester, or whether you only did it in one class, or you made it a whole, you made a whole fucking academic career around it. It doesn't even matter if you knew you did it or not, right? It doesn't matter if you knew you cheated or not. And that's something we'll get into as this series continues. This series on cheating continues, right? Whether you even know what you're doing is actually cheating, according to your teachers. So even if you knew you were doing it, you probably did it. And like I said, in those cases where you knew you did it, you know why you did it. School is stressful at all levels, and everything around you is a constant battle for your time and attention. If you're an older student, whether in high school or really deep into your grad school or something, you're in your 20s, you're in grad school, you're really deep into it, you might be a parent, you might have a spouse, right? You might have a family that is dependent on you in some way. They're dependent on you working, and you're probably getting that degree because you want to get a better job so you can support them better, you can support your family better. And you're probably, like I said, you're probably working. You probably are or were in a daily, just awful struggle and grind for your life and well-being and the lives and well-beings of other people, right? And even if you're like a young student, so you're not working, you're not a fucking adult. Let's say you're a kid in like fourth grade or something. Well, first of all, if you're a kid in fourth grade listening to this podcast isn't for you, right? So obviously by listening to this podcast, you're cooler than all your classmates. You're epic. One day I hope you'll grow up to be like an awesome anarcho-communist type, right? And also, I would also suggest, check into the climate change stuff. If you don't have if you haven't had a teacher that has made you wise to that, yeah, check in on climate change. Google climate change, and see what's up with that. It'll be really important. It'll be real important as you get old. Yeah, so you just think about that. Anyway, even for you, this rhetorical, awesome 10-year-old, school is stressful, and you have a lot of other priorities. You're trying to enjoy your youth. You have friends, I hope. You're trying to spend time with them, whether they're in school, they're online. You want to spend time socializing, develop interests, all that shit. Become a well-rounded person. And just like with older and adult students, family is pressuring you in certain ways. So you're not supporting people, but you have parents, you have people who are in charge of you. Your parents, right? Let's say you even have both of your parents. They're both there breathing down your neck, expecting you to do well in your classes because school is supposed to be your quote unquote job as a kid. I'm sure we've all heard that, haven't we? I've certainly heard that from my parents, especially if you're an American, I would imagine. They want you to get into a good university because they want to see you get a good quote unquote real job. That's the whole point of doing well in kindergarten all the way through high school. You're supposed to go to a good university and then you're going to get a real job, right? And when I just said that, I just said, if you had both parents, if you're living with a single parent or if you don't have any parents, you're an orphan, you're living with relatives are taking care of you. There's probably all sorts of other things going on in your life that are way more important than listening to your teacher and doing what they say, exactly how they say it, exactly the way they want you to do it. No kid is free from all of that. Even those privileged kids who have both of their parents who live pretty comfortably, there are pressures on every single kid, right? No, we don't all feel it equally, but those pressures are there for everybody. And that really is the crux of it to me. This is a big reason. This is one of the big reasons why I don't take cheating really seriously, right? If you're working class, no matter how old you are, There are just so many other things that need your attention in a much more urgent way than school, right? If you're really down on the ladder, on the social ladder, like if you're living in your fucking car or your parents' car or in like those spontaneous shanty towns that the homeless live in, right? Made of cardboard and laminated iron, the wavy like sheet metal. I don't know what the fuck you call it. Then, if that's you, then there is a daily fight every day just to survive. If you're doing a little better than that, if you're a little higher on the ladder, you live in like a house, you're still exposed maybe to like a violent neighborhood. Maybe every day is like a battle to get like resources to get good food. You know what I mean? Maybe you're not sure every day if you're going to have like some real solid meals or clean water. I mean, certainly, right? Being able to have like cheap school materials, pens and notebooks and stuff. Even making sure you have like paper or like a calculator somewhere. If maybe being able to have like a phone with all those things, a calculator and a calendar and all that stuff, and an internet connection, right? Just being able to make sure you have an internet connection, which if your household, isn't making enough to afford a private one, you're depending on a library or an internet cafe or a friend's house or relative's house to sort of do everything in terms of like an internet connection. And like I said, if you're older, you have a job because you have rent and you need to eat. So for gigantic swaths of the population, my point in this speech here is that every month, every week, every day is a logistical fight to make sure we have enough things we need to be able to survive. Food and water and heating and, whatever it is that we need. So all of that is way more urgent and important than making an honest effort at school. And before most of us start cheating, we do try to find ways to work ethically, quote unquote ethically, within the class to save ourselves some trouble, right? We ask the teacher for help, you ask your friends for help, you go to the administration for help, whatever help might be in your situation. You get deadline extensions, you ask for some tutoring, some time, some extra time in the library after school to do work because, there's internet there, there's peace and quiet there. Like, it's just as long as we're talking about things you ask the school to give you, just getting a real lunch so that you're not constantly hungry throughout the whole day. You can actually concentrate because you can't have it you can't have your lunch made at home beforehand. And like the line to get the school lunch for people who have some kind of voucher or, they're part of some program or maybe not even like may not even be on welfare. It's just like the fucking line is always too long. You can't get like a real meal on time in that fucking 40 minutes you have to actually eat lunch in a K through 12. Or at a university, you're just so busy between work and school writing essays that you don't find time to like eat. If you can, we're talking about universities and colleges, you can drop the class, you can take the F, try again next year. If you're K through 12, you do that too. You go to summer school, try again next year. But there's all sorts of problems with that in terms of in university and college, financial aid, if you're getting it, your academic standing, throughout all levels of school, all sorts of those kinds of problems, those kinds of like bureaucratic and record problems that haunt you throughout the rest of your young life. You try to navigate all of that before you're like, fuck it, I'm just going to do what makes this all easy. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to cut corners because I've given an honest effort. I've tried my best to work within the system and I just can't anymore. It's time to make this easy. And every school and institution of higher learning, certainly most researchers who study this kind of stuff, make this seem like a choice about, ethics and like the tragedy of choosing to do something so clearly awful, the tragedy of moral failure. And most people who write about this, or, they opine about it, they write in a column about it, they research it, they do that from that perspective too. This ethical and moral panic. What almost all of them fail to even sort of take into account is the totalizing nature of school and universities in our daily lives, right? And the way that you as the student and we as a society are just supposed to take that as a given about life. That every day for obviously all children and teenagers, but also for, I would imagine a lot of college students, most cohorts of college students, that the number one priority every day and the number one concern of every day is, what do I need to do for school? What's my homework that I need to get done for tomorrow? What reading do I have to do? What fucking obnoxious Google Classroom module do I have to complete and comment on for 5 points before the end of the week? Schools and universities don't usually say this out loud, but this is the assumption they work on when they communicate as an institution with parents and with students, that they are just supposed to be the number one thing going on in your life. So ultimately, the reason why they work is, the reason why universities, institutions, certain kinds of people, they work on this assumption is because society, and certainly American society, and probably across most places in the world, has made schools and universities, the institution of education in general, the primary mode of social and class mobility, particularly for working class and poor people. But in our fucking desperate age, in our desperate times where things are getting worse objectively, and they absolutely fucking feel like it too, what schools and universities, what education offers people, again, especially the poor and working class, is safety from downward class mobility. It's protection from being homeless in your 20s and 30s. So of course you need to make school and homework and grades and all that shit the number one thing you need to think about, because nothing else will even make you the promise of being safe from the potential fall down the social ladder. Maybe your life sucks right now. You have to work a dog shit job for hours upon hours every day, every week for garbage pay, and it's all barely enough. You're barely scraping by. But think about this. You could be homeless, right? You could be homeless. And if you don't have a good degree in some shit, then that's where you'll end up. You'll end up homeless if you don't get that degree. Now, if you're already homeless, like, more and more college and university students are becoming, and more K through 12 students are becoming, well, a degree in some dumb shit is the only way you're ever going to not be homeless. And let's say you're a little more comfortable. Maybe you think of yourself as middle class when you take a real look at your life. You're not worrying about where your next meal is coming from or anything like that. Well, the message to you is, take a look at all those homeless people on the other side of town. Take a look at all those guys who have to do Uber or work at the fucking Walmart to get by on minimum wage on fucking 4-6 hours every day. Now, if you don't want to be like that, you need to get a degree in some shit. So get those grades up, qualify for a scholarship or financial aid to get those tuition fees down. And once you're in college, make sure you're still keeping those grades up, because you don't want to be kicked out of your scholarship or your aid or, the contract you have with your parents or anything else like that. Anything else that good grades earn for you. And that's just simple reality, right? I'm not saying anything crazy there. That's just life. That's life as a student at all ages and levels. And I would say, when talking about students at all ages and levels, that's the truth. That's the reality for the vast majority of all students, except like the most elite class of students, the most elite class of people in American society. Their kids are going to grow up and, they're always going to have money and power anyway, no matter how much they fuck about in college, with college, what kind of grades they get, what kind of degree they end up getting, whatever. They're always going to be rich. They're always going to be elite. There simply isn't enough time for the rest of us to approach every single class at any level of education with the time you need to understand the subject in a completely honest and open-minded way. Yet schools and universities have you act like you are giving full effort on every single class, because that's part of navigating education. That's part of navigating your school and getting the help you need when you ask for it. And in that conflict between acting like You're giving a solid effort all the time when you're at school, and the reality of having to make cuts and having to make decisions about your attention and time, something has to give. You need to make a decision about whether paying rent, eating a decent meal, making sure, other people in your household or in your family can have decent meals and a roof over their heads, having a bare minimum healthy social life, whether that's what you want to do, that's what you have to do, or whether being a good student, being a good quote-unquote academic citizen, whatever the fuck, and actually trying to understand what your classes are talking about, writing a good paper for the current essay unit is what you have to do. And of course, just as a 7 of 9 said once on Star Trek Voyager, the worst Star Trek, cheating is often more efficient. You can steal money and food, I guess, but that's way more dangerous. And more people are watching, right? More people are watching for people trying to steal their money and their food. Cheating in your class is just way more logistically, operationally easy to pull off. And you'll probably get in less trouble, depending on what you're doing. So the question is not really, to get right down to it, the question really isn't why do students cheat and how can we stop them? The better question is, why is it that more students don't cheat? And how can schools and universities change what they're doing to incentivize cheating less? Maybe we'll start answering that too later on once we're done with our history lesson. But anyway, so the whole point of all I'm saying there is that that's the baseline I want to start with before we talk about the rest of what we're going to be talking about in this video. I'm going to be building on that baseline with every video because this is, we're talking about the intersection of education and schools with society, and even in this long-ass introduction, we're not getting to every single important aspect of that. So even just within this series on academic dishonesty, we're always going to be coming back to what I'm saying right now. But what is the spine of this series on academic dishonesty? Well, I'm going to look at a bunch of different articles and opinions and, all that from about over the last 15 years. I think I said earlier, about the 90's to throughout the 2000s and the post-pandemic age. And what we're trying to see is where universities and schools have twisted and turned and trying to do anything to stop students from cheating, except for actually prioritizing the students' material needs above their scholastic ones, instead of ever actually wondering or attempting to make sure that every student has this baseline, bare minimum, decent life so that they can actually try and focus on school. And we're also going to be talking about how in taking those twists and turns, universities and schools, the education system, have helped create a really shitty education system, modern day education system, even shittier than it used to be. So the solution for all of this, the solution they're always coming up with, is to look at the student body as a chronically unethical, almost criminal-like group of people that at all times needs to be policed and monitored to make sure that they don't overstep the, ultimately arbitrary boundaries of, educational conduct and academic dishonesty and all that stuff. And to that end, they convince themselves that they must open the doors for big tech to come in, invade the privacy of the student body from admission, when they apply to go to a school, to every submission of every assignment and test, to turn teachers into cops, and to transfer. All right, so whenever we have to talk about cheating, we always have to think about, at the very least, the technology that's available at the time. And it's completely absurd nowadays to talk about cheating, academic dishonesty, without talking about smartphones or laptops, computer, or anything to do with the internet, right? But I want to take you back to a land before time, the age of talking dinosaurs, where these conversations weren't about, downloading the Uber of cheating apps or whatever that would be called, Chegg or something, and then getting some Cambodian immigrant gig worker to deliver some essay you bought off the dark web or something. You're hiding your traffic with a VPN because you're just that afraid of being caught. So none of that is going on. This is a time where all those words are complete gibberish, meaningless. Let's go back to this utopian golden age. This is the 90's.
I remember way back.
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is on. So is Frasier. Seinfeld. Just a couple of my favorite shows. Some other shows, I guess, were on. Okay, look, I didn't really do a whole lot of background cultural research here. I mean, if you're the kind of person who's listening to this kind of podcast, you probably know what this time is about in broad strokes, right? So it's that magical time between the fall or the coming fall of the Soviet Union, but before the War on Terror. It's the Fukuyama end of history. Now, speaking personally, my parents meet in California in 91. I'm born in 93, so it's a very optimistic time, right? Optimistic if you're rich or middle class and white. It's a great time for you guys. There is a spike in violent crime and property crime in the early 90's everywhere in the country, but those rates plummet afterwards and throughout the mid to late 90's. So crime rates were always falling in the most infamous, dangerous cities, in the Bay Area, places like Oakland and Richmond, LA, obviously throughout LA County, more south in California. Yet a very insidious narrative about black crime by non-white people in general, is coming into its modern, current day form, right? We don't even have to talk about things like the Rodney King riots and all the horrible discourse that generates in the decade after, but you probably know what I mean, right? The super predators and all that. And eventually the government reacts to all this discourse with the passing of the Clinton crime bill, which, is great. It's done a lot of great things for black people, non-white people. It's awesome. /S. I remember a lot of, speaking as a Latino man, I remember a lot of similarly insidious narratives about Spanish-speaking immigrants and their children starting to fester during these times too. The Mexican hordes jumping the fence, being all those beaners and all that kind of stuff. But, of course, the most poisonous, violent myths are being made about black people. At the same time, the economy appears to be working out. It appears to be, a economic golden age for America. Again, that's true if you're white and at least middle class. Home ownership is going up. This is before the financial crash in 2008, and the people who are owning those houses are also making more money than homeowners in generations past. Now, if you're like a poor category of person, or if you're not owning a house, like you rent an apartment or rent a room, whatever you're doing, things are actually getting kind of worse throughout the 90's. It actually gets harder for you to get a house throughout the 90's, and you're making less money once the decade's over. But for that population of people that can afford to send their kids in their households to school, to college, and who eventually go on to become academics, life looks like it's getting better all over the nation. And so it's also a time before the ubiquitous ownership of cell phones and laptops and other such devices. It's even way before a time before where there is ubiquitous internet access everywhere. You can even imagine life like that. A lot of people have email addresses. That's definitely a thing starting in the early 90s, probably even before the 90s. Certainly if you're a professor in a university, probably if you're a student, you have an email address, but almost everyone is getting their news from the television, their local news television station, their local radio station, the local newspaper, and also, from talking to people around them about what's going on. If you wanted to look up a random piece of information, you'd have to, depending on how rich you were, you could get a real fucking physical encyclopedia. You remember that? You remember the people who would go door to door selling fucking encyclopedia sets? That was a big sitcom joke in the 90s. If you had enough money, you'd have a series of a certain brand of encyclopedia in your house. And of course, you're thinking about that. You have to update that encyclopedia set every so often because information's changing all the time. So, that was fun. A fun time of buying encyclopedias. Otherwise, if that wasn't you have to go to like a public library and look that shit up. And if you were a student at a school, like, a K through 12 or a university or whatever, you'd go to the school library if you wanted to look something up. You had to know. So cell phones and laptops and the various ways that they existed in American society during the 90s, they were big, ugly, bulky pieces of shit. Culturally, if you had a cell phone or a laptop, that was usually a sign you were a kind of like successful business class of person. It's even a little gauche in a cultural sense, honestly. Like, I remember episodes from like speaking of television, The Fresh Prince and Frasier, where characters would get cell phones or laptops, and it was treated like, who the fuck does this guy think he is? Fucking big roller over here. So there's certain cell phones and laptops certainly are not avenues of learning or information like they are now, right? And so this begins to change even before the end of the 90s. And in fact, I did read in some papers about there being like computer repositories of things like old tests and textbooks, but we don't have our modern understanding of how technology influences our knowledge and education until about, I want to say 2005. About it, we don't read. Our modern age is not really created until that time. And so it's against this backdrop that I want to talk about what, all those silly gooses in academia are up to, how they do research into cheating and all that shit. It's ubiquitous across researchers in this field before the 90s. So before the 90s, most researchers into cheating believe that cheating is basically a crime, or at least it's on the same spectrum of behaviors and psychology as crime. And of course, by crime, right, you're not made to think like tax fraud or whatever. You're meant to think of things like, dealing drugs, mugging people on the street, pickpocketing, breaking into people's homes, that kind of stuff, right? And the students are basically criminals. So for the decades before the 90s, research into why students cheat really focused on, to the near total exclusion of any other factors, like what a future scholar will describe as, quote, individual predispositions to cheat, unquote. So you can hear that, you can read that, and immediately know what that means. It's like, do men cheat more than women? Do people with certain types of personalities cheat more than others? There's a lot of type A, type B shit in a lot of these older papers and in some papers throughout the 90s. Like, what types of mental health conditions influence the disposition to cheat, right? So basically, like, thinking that people with mental health problems are more likely to be criminals or are more likely to, be a bad person, be a bad boy. Do students who come into the university with lower grade point averages cheat more often? So, criminals, they're stupid, and just like a cheater would be stupid. That's honestly the implication there. Stuff like that. So stuff about, like, if you listen to any kind of like true crime stuff, it's all about like psychoanalyzing the criminal mind and creating like a criminal profile of cheaters and shit like that. It's all about like what kind of personality or individual circumstances would make a person want to do evil in the world, right? Like, cheating is on the same spectrum of evil as just being a criminal as an adult. So there were even some papers that I read that tried to test and survey correlations between cheating and drug use, right? Which, just even asking that question as a research question, as the base for a paper, is just so evidently fraught with like problematic ideas that it's really wild to me. Maybe that's just me going back and projecting my 2020s cultural bias on that time, but I would even think even for that time, the discourse around drug use should have given some people some pause before coming up with questions like that. So I want to quote from one paper that I think is representative of these viewpoints. I will actually not just quote, but just to like read extensively from one paper. And the title of that paper is "Cheating in College is for a Career: Academic Dishonesty in the 90s" by a dude named Stephen F. Davis. And so in this paper, and basically in a lot of other papers too, the way they try to research cheating is they just send an anonymous survey to a bunch of schools, and they rely on the schools to give out these surveys to the students, and then they return them anonymously so that no one gets in trouble. That's basically what this guy did. That's what all the other guys I'm going to be reading about did. And so he wrote a survey. One of the very first questions on the survey he sent that he talks about in this paper is a question asking the students whether they thought it was, quote unquote, wrong to cheat. Like, even back then, I would feel like that would be such a pointless question. Like, almost no one feels like it's right to cheat naturally. No one goes into college with just natural criminal inclination to cheat on tests and papers. Like, just like no one naturally becomes a banker or an accountant and then they go on to do Enron scams, or they direct financial policy at Lehman Brothers or some shit. Like, that's not like a inclination. That behavior is externally incentivized. And I think all students either know that it's wrong and feel that it's wrong throughout their cheating. How deeply they feel that, obviously, that depends. But I do think it's every student. Or they justify it enough to convince themselves that they can go through with it when they do try it, when they do end up deciding to cheat. But the need to justify cheating when a student cheats, that's also externally provided. The reason to ask this question about whether you think it's wrong to cheat at all, the whole purpose of asking that question is to go down this line of thought of, well, if they know it's wrong, why do they cheat? Why do they think it's okay? Like, I mean, like, give me a break, really. Give me a fucking break. Like, don't we live in society? Like, don't we understand why people do wrong things? Like, what? Like, what, dude? Come on. Moving on to a different part here. So this is Stephen F. Davis writing. One specific goal of the second questionnaire was to investigate the frequency of cheating. Evaluation of repeat offenders yielded some rather disturbing data. In high school, the majority, 52% of those who cheated, were repeat offenders. The average number of offenses was 6.47. The figures are only slightly better when we consider repeat offenders in college. 48% of those who cheat in college do so on multiple occasions. The average number of offenses for collegiate repeat offenders is 4.25. A closer analysis of the multiple offenders provides a clue concerning the genesis of the collegiate repeat offender. Virtually all, 98.64% of the students who reported cheating on multiple occasions in college had also cheated on multiple occasions in high school. Of the students who reported cheating only once in high school, only 24.36% reported cheating in college, and then no more than on one occasion. Of the students who did not cheat in high school, only 1.51% reported cheating in college, and then no more than on one occasion. The message inherent in these results and their potential extrapolation to the future behavior are clear. If you have paid close attention to these figures, the answer is yes to two questions that may have occurred to you. Great writing, by the way. Quote, whether it be in high school or in college, women reported lower cheating rates than men. While this difference has not always been statistically reliable on a sample-by-sample basis, I am quite confident that the meta-analysis would yield a highly significant effect. And so on, right? So we can see right there, we're doing repeat offender analysis here, which should be setting up some big red flags. It certainly does for me, right? Just for related context. Like, this paper, I think I did kind of a bad job introducing this paper. This paper, I think, was published in March 93. And so in just a year or two later, honestly, or before, in the years before and since this paper was published, 3 strikes laws were becoming more popular across the United States. And it's not exactly the same rhetoric, but it's definitely a lot of we're by examining the students kind of as criminals, we're catching a lot of stray discourse from that conversation into this paper. And of course, you also saw there too, right? Just making this big difference between men and women who cheat, very classic criminal analysis kind of stuff. And let me just give you one more example of this type of rhetoric that is going on here. So on page 9, reading towards the end of page 9 of this paper, to what extent do students fear being caught? Quote, our recent data indicates that of those students who reported cheating in college, less than 50% expressed concern about being detected. It is noteworthy that the majority, 63% of the students who expressed concern over detection, were those who reported cheating only on one occasion. Moreover, the fear of detection differed in intensity between one-time and multiple offenders on a scale that ranged from minimally fearful 1 to very fearful 7. The average score of the multiple offender was 3.12, with the average score of the single offenders was 5.87. So in sum, fewer multiple offenders fear being caught, and what fear they have is less intent than that of the one-time offenders, unquote. So yeah, just more example of that kind of rhetoric. And of course, again, just this whole difference of like the fear of being caught, like, being a career cheater versus just doing it once and like trying to make a significant difference between that. It's all very criminal psychology kind of stuff. But if you want like a clear example of looking at the student as a criminal, Davis does get way worse than this. Reading from the top, I believe, of page 11. So, quote, having considered the prevalence of cheating and some of the causes and motivations for engaging in such behaviors, I felt it might be interesting to examine how this crime is being perpetrated. After all, if we are able to catch academic thieves, it will help us know their modus operandi. So again, you could just listen to that fucking vocabulary, that fucking rhetoric. Like, I don't think I'm crazy here for going like, holy shit, that's just so psychotic. Like, to me, that's just so crazy. Like, those are students, man. Like, have some control over yourself. These aren't members of the fucking mafia or like of a fucking gang, of a fucking organized, an extremely sophisticated organized gang or something, But like, his tone throughout this is very much like he's examining the attitudes of street level arms dealers or some shit, and there it comes out very clearly. And he goes on like this. So on pages 12 and 13, so he's talking about like some interviews he gave with students. Well, not interviews. They were asked on the survey to describe how they cheated, and you could tell by the way I'm reading, I'm not terribly interested in like the survey itself or how he did it, just in like his rhetoric and like the way he talks about it and how he interprets his data. And in one part of the surveys, he asked like the people who said yes, they cheated a lot, to describe how they would cheat. He has like a neat little list here, and I'm going to read it because I think it's funny. But also, we're going to examine more of it, like the way Davis looks at students like criminals. So, quote, our respondents were asked to describe these other methods if they had been used. These answers provided some real food for thought. If we could only harness these creative energies in a more productive manner. So the list starts, 1, quote, we worked out a system of hand and feet positions. The foot position or foot movement theme was mentioned by several students, Davis writes in a note. 2, each corner of the desktop matched an answer. A, B, C, or D. We simply touched the corner we thought was the right answer. So hand signals were favored with several students, Davis says in another note. 3, the teacher got the test from a book that was in the library. So everyone had the answers before the test was given. Terrible teacher. Oh my God. 4, I stole a copy of the test and looked up the answer ahead of time and memorized them. This theme reappeared in a number of questions. That's not a theme. That's just... I don't know. Whatever. That's another Davis quote. 5, I hid a calculator down my pants. 6, we traded papers during the test and compared answers. Wow. What was the teacher doing? 7, opened up my book and looked at the answers. A real sophisticated shit going on there. If only we could take that creativity and harness it in a more productive manner. Here's one that's actually kind of good. 8, the answers were tape recorded before the test, and I just took my Walkman to class and listened to the answers during the test. Oh my God. I mean, man, you could just tell how technology snuck up on a bunch of teachers. Like, man, they wouldn't. Can you just imagine trying to do something like that today? No teacher would be fooled by that. Anyway, 9. I had small Velcro fasteners attached to my boots. I wore the answers on paper that had the Velcro backs and attached them to my boots. To see the answers, all I had to do was cross my legs. That's actually pretty good. 10, I've done everything from writing all the way up to my arm to having notes in a plastic bag inside my mouth. 11, I would make a paper flower, write notes on it, and then pin it on my blouse. Very cool. 12, one student fills in 2 Scantron answer sheets and passes one to a friend. I don't know. That seems logistically kind of inconvenient. 13, I wrote the answers on my thigh and raised my skirt to see them during the test. I mean, the age before, like, we would come to accept men wearing skirts and transgender people, a woman only strategy. Sorry guys. 14, I asked the last period students about the test. Yeah, let's harness that creativity and into like more productive activities. And so Davis concludes this little list here by saying, quote, "This sampling of creative methodology indicates that faculty members may not be able to afford themselves the luxury of reading a book, writing, or grading papers during an examination. Vigilance appears to be the key word here." So he notes before this section, you might have actually kind of heard me read a bit of it before I introduced the list. He says before the list that these cute little like anecdotes of the way some of these students cheated, these actually represent the least common forms of cheating on tests. So most students either use crib notes or they copied off another paper 80% of the time. So non-collaborative or nothing really sophisticated. So I do have to ask myself, like, what the fuck is the point of listing these out then, of including this list here? So I know he says at the end, like, teachers must be vigilant, like, but how are they going to, you expect a teacher to look at like girls lifting their skirts and seeing if they wrote something on it, or like checking their brooches to see if their ants, or like their fucking mouths, their pants to see if they have their books or calculators there? Vigilant for what? That's obvious. That's a ridiculous conclusion. So to me, the only real point of this list the point of his pithy conclusion here, it can only really be to gawk at the way students are resorting to passing tests in their classes. I mean, that's what we did. We had a good laugh. But to me, when I think about the time period, when I think about Davis, this academic, he's a psychology academic. I think that's the way to say it. And his audience is, of course, other academics, other teachers. The only reason that Davis and those people would gawk or the reason to make readers gawk at that is to invoke the emotional reaction of, oh my God, these students are more devious than I ever thought. Something needs to be done to combat these criminal masterminds. And that's what Davis more or less says after he's done in that conclusion I read there, right? And just to say it again. So this sampling of creative methodology indicates that faculty members may not be able to afford themselves the luxury of reading a book, writing, grading papers during an examination. Vigilance appears to be the key word here. Very lame. Like, honestly, when I think about like making students take a test, which I never do that. But to the extent that I ever would, like, a big reason would be just to give myself some time to like catch up on like grades or some shit. But like, so a teacher can't even be able to relax during the test. They always have to be policing people's skirts and pants. Dumb. Very lame. He does try to kind of preface the list. I think I read parts of it, right? The whole thing about like, if we could only harness this energy for good instead of evil, right? As like a reason for having it. But obviously that's a bullshit reason. But if to even take like what he said there at face value, right? If only we could harness these creative energies in a more productive manner. Like, who the fuck do you think is responsible for that, dude? The teachers in the universities. Oh my God. Like, holy shit. Like, I know it's the 90's and the conversation about designing better classroom practices and pedagogy is way different than it is now. It's way different than it would even be in like the 2000s. But people back then had better ideas than fucking tests, right? About getting people's creative energies in a more productive manner. You know, we should be expecting more from these kinds of people, from Davis, from people like Davis, right? Like, this is, oh my God, it's so limp. This writing is so limp. His reasoning is so ridiculous. And it is all just meant to be like looking at students as suspiciously as humanly possible. And to go on that theme, like Davis is also very casually dismissive of the students' opinions on all this. And even towards faculty opinions to the small extent that they're in the study. In a section called Discouraging Cheating in the Classroom, he asked the students what their preferred modes of punishment and dealing with cheaters are. You know, to me, that's an extremely important question to ask students in terms of like I think it's absolutely necessary to ask students about this if we're going to have this punishment relationship with the students. You know, students are a body of people that are punished, but they can't punish back. Like, the students can't collectively penalize the school for whatever reason, in any kind of institutional way, right? I mean, obviously, you could strike, you could do collective action, but that's not going through an institution. It's not a legal framework. In the same way that a university can punish a student for cheating, or a school can like give a student detention or anything. And if you're not in favor of like that kind of relationship, right? If you're not in favor of the students having institutional power over the actions of administrators and teachers and the school itself, like if that's something you don't want to happen, then I think it's important to involve the students in the process of punishment and informing the ways that they get punished. But Davis is not at all a guy who thinks like that. He does not go down this completely logical train of thought. So after listing, like I'm not going to read it because it's not that interesting, but he lists the preferences of the students, the ways that they would like to be punished if they got caught cheating. And once he's done listing them, Davis says, several of the preferred deterrents, such as having separate forms of the exam and separating the students by a desk, do have merit. Common sense also suggests that some of the less preferred methods might also prove to be effective. However, their implementation may be rather difficult. For example, students have a notorious dislike for all essay tests. Legitimate reasons for not preferring to have assigned seats and not wanting to leave one's belongings outside the classroom are less obvious. So, just like I said, very dismissive of what the students think, right? He writes with this very obvious assumptions about the seriousness of cheating and what needs to be done about it, right? So just being like, there's no good reason to not want to leave your backpack outside your backpack, your bag outside of the fucking classroom because we're trying to catch cheaters here and that's what matters. And like, how about the fucking students aren't kindergartners? How about that? How about respecting the fact that they're adults and that they're not babies? I think that's a little bit more important. But he is assuming that nothing is more important, even if it means infantilizing and just surveilling the students like they're first graders, as long as it contributes to catching cheaters. And to me, the entire structure of the survey he sent and the paper he's writing based on it is constructed to support these assumptions about the seriousness of cheating and what needs to be done about it. Let me give you another example. And so this is the bottom of page 20. Quote, however, it was disheartening to find that the most popular quote-unquote punishment, he puts punishment in scare quotes, was to tell the students to keep their eyes on their own paper. The efficacy of this approach certainly is debatable. Likewise, one might question the advisability of simply taking the test away and allowing the student to start over. Regrettably, over 20% of students endorsed these two options. More optimistically, another 20% of the students did endorse awarding a failing grade to someone who had been caught cheating. These two apparently divergent viewpoints may well represent the opinion of those who have and have not engaged in academically dishonest behavior, respectively. So the bad students don't agree with me, but the good students do agree with me, is his basic point right there. That he's covering up in all sorts of ridiculous language and nonsense, just assumptions and nonsense and terrible rhetoric. It's even more infuriating towards the end. Right. So before I go to the end of it, at the end of the paper, in the introduction to this paper, Davis references an earlier study he did where he asks the students why they cheated. And so, quote, having established the fact that academic dishonesty is widespread and represents a major threat to the integrity of higher education, a consideration of the causes involved seems to be in order. Over 50 years ago, Drake 1941, proposed that stress and the pressure for good grades were important determinants for academic dishonesty. Reflecting the continued importance of these factors, Keller, 1976, reported that 69% of the students in his study cited pressure for good grades as a major reason for cheating. In more recent reports, Bayard in 1980 and Barnett and Dalton in 1981 indicated these pressures remain important. Our most recent study also attempted to delineate the specific causes of academic dishonesty. The most frequently cited reason for cheating was, I do study, but cheat to enhance my scores. 29.75% of the respondents said that. Quote, my job cuts down on my study time, 14.28%. And, quote, usually don't study at 13.60%. Also were high on the list. I cheat so my GPA looks better to my prospective employers at 8.16%. And I feel pressure from parents to get good grades, so I cheat. That 6.80% is also receives substantial endorsement. A variety of other reasons, such as, pass to class is too hard, only if I'm not sure of my answers, if I blank out in someone else's papers in clear sight, provide considerable food for thought, and accounted for 18.36% of the reasons for cheating. The number of references to external causes and situations is noteworthy. Situational factors also appear to have exacerbated the frequency of cheating. For example, the emergence of large crowded classes in which multiple choice tests are the preferred mode of evaluation has been found to be conducive to cheating. And he gets that from Houston, 1976. The problems created by this situation are compounded by the lack of secretarial assistance for the preparation of alternate forms of examinations. The availability of computerized test banks, which offer instructors the ability to scramble the order of test questions, as well as the answers for individual questions, appears to offer potential relief for this particular problem. And so that's a lot of end quote. So that a lot of that are things that I let off in the introduction to this podcast episode, right? It even includes some things I didn't touch upon, things that happen in the classroom that aren't the students' fault, that induce cheating. So he even references like class sizes, in the advent of certain technologies as situational factors. So you could see here, the students are straight up telling him in his own survey, I got a job, I got future career prospects to worry about. Right? I don't study, I can't get the grades I want on my own. And, what words does David have for all that? All those completely reasonable, understandable motivations for cheating from people who otherwise wouldn't cheat if those pressures weren't there, presumably. Quote, clearly, Davis says, many of the students in our two studies do not have a well-developed, internalized sense of integrity, academic or otherwise. Hence, their behavior is directed to a great extent by external pressures. And a little further on, he goes, corroborating the importance of external agents, Forsyth, Pope, and McMillan in 1985 reported data pertaining to the attributional analysis of, you gotta love these fucking words in these papers, analysis of academic dishonesty. When they compared the casual inferences of cheaters and non-cheaters, they found that the external attributions of cheaters were significantly greater than those of non-cheaters. Equally relevant was the finding that the number of external attributions made by cheaters for the dishonest act was significantly greater than those made by a group of uninvolved observers. Fuck, really? Wow. In short, those who cheat are providing themselves with excuses, is his word, excuses for this type of behavior. While several of the preventative measures we can have considered may deter cheating on a situation-to-situation basis, our data also indicates that such measures will not succeed in the long run. Only when the students have developed a stronger commitment to the educational process and an internalized code of ethics which opposes cheating will the problem have been dealt with effectively. So, go fuck yourself. That's my response to that. Go fuck yourself, for real. Davis is absolutely and completely throwing all the concerns of the students about their limited time and energy, their worries about future employment, their pressures by their family, by expectations that society puts on them, everything into the fucking garbage and calling them excuses. It doesn't even occur to him, talking about uninvolved observers. It doesn't even occur to him that an uninvolved observer of cheating, someone to whom cheating isn't something that would occur to them to do, right? Because they're an uninvolved observer. They're not cheating. That person doesn't have to go through the process of justifying it to themselves and making peace with it, and thus would have less reason to think about why someone would cheat. But because they are uninvolved observers who wouldn't cheat anyway, the external pressures are probably, obviously, different, right? You can apply that to literally any action. When I play a video game, I play Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I lose and I get pissy. Someone, a non-involved observer would be looking at me what a fucking freak. What are you? Why don't you calm the fuck down? And it's just like, that when you're in the situation of choosing to play the video game and then you're losing and then all that kind of stuff, like the situation is different than when you're just looking. So of course, someone who's just looking at me getting pissy because I lost a video game, like they're not going to have the imagination to understand why anyone would get pissy, right? Whereas people who do play the video game, who aren't just uninvolved, they understand like the kinds of things that motivate you to have that kind of reaction. And that's so obvious to me. And the fact, again, Davis here is just mocking that. He's just mocking the fact that, like, that people can experience different external pressures, and that is going to motivate them to do different things. Now, it's all just about, we need a good code of ethics that opposes cheating. We need to instill integrity in the students. Like total nonsense. Like that is just a balloon filled with air of an idea. Like Davis is very clearly, to me, engulfed in just pure neoliberal ideology in this paper. The way he attributes what is clearly a social phenomenon to individual acts of deviancy and dishonor, and the way he dismisses any non-individual factors of cheating as excuses. So this neoliberalism is even more obvious in the last paragraph of the entire study. It's great. I'm just going to read it here to you. We begin with, quote, the hypothesis that a theory of understanding is needed. What constitutes understanding? According to Ludwigson's model, there are 6 major components of understanding, and then there's 6. I don't know. Yeah, there's 6 levels of understand. I've never heard of this before. He just says like, understanding is not rote memorization. Understanding is not learning lots of isolated facts. Understanding involves the creation of a personal. Understanding involves perspective. Whatever stuff like that. So that's a theory of understanding, I guess. Such a theory of understanding, Davis says, is one that naturally resists cheating because cheating deprives individuals of opportunities to test their personal theories of understanding. Now let's see if we can't tie this model back to reality a bit and indicate its importance. If you are willing to assume that understanding is required for competence, then the following relations tend to flow naturally. Competence, in turn, is required for success. Success is required for self-reliance, and self-reliance is required for happiness. Undermining the basic building blocks of understanding through cheating weakens the entire chain of events that follows. If one personally subscribes to such a model and then teaches it with fervor to his or her students, I believe the result would be a decrease in academic dishonesty. So nothing. That's a whole lot of nothing. That's waffle. It's absolute waffle. Not even a waffle. It's fucking buttermilk. This opinion, this fucking conclusion has the same rigor and consistency as uncooked pancake batter. And again, just like neoliberal, just all those solutions are just, well, teachers need to teach students about integrity. When you have this theory of understanding, then you want to test your personal achievements and you don't want to cheat. Oh my God. Just, it's so, I keep saying neoliberal. It's so crooked. It's so stunted in terms of like the way, like the supposed psychology academic understands people. It's ridiculous. I said it was neoliberal, right? And I stick by that. I don't think though that this discussion on cheating and academic dishonesty fits super neatly like on the left-right spectrum. So I am a socialist. I believe in socialism as a social project. I believe in indigenous rights. I believe in land back. I believe in the advancement of black power as a necessary global movement. I believe in police abolition. I believe in dissolving the state and living in a society without it, all that good stuff. But I think that those of you who share those opinions and positions would probably think about my opinion on cheating so far, my apologist opinion on it, my dismissive opinion on it, and, you would go, Axel, come on, don't be fucking ridiculous. Cheating is just so obviously wrong, and you're just being silly or contrarian, trying to frame it as radical and leftist, right? And to that, I'll say, well, I haven't framed it as that, so if that's what you're thinking, then, you haven't been listening. But I'll also say that I do think there is a social critique of cheating. and academic dishonesty, which I'll get to, probably not in this video, but we'll get into like real objections to cheating that aren't based on like ridiculous calls to morality and criminal psychology. But the flip side of that is that you can absolutely take a right-wing conservative framework to studying cheating and then come away with right-wing conservative conclusions and then go on to form a right-wing conservative academic environment, right? Like, and what those right-wing conservative frameworks and conclusions and environments do is criminalize the student, whether they're cheating or not, or doing anything else or not, and create a very simplistic crime and punishment relationship with the teachers and with the schools that can only ever lead to a worse and less effective academic system, which it has, by the way. It already has, and which I hope to show in the next parts of this series. And that's what Davis's paper does here. Whether he knew it or not. I mean, as bad as his is, I mean, like, it's really repulsive, honestly. It's really ridiculous. It's nonsensical. It's honestly not too different from how other papers write about it. And at this point, I have to ask these writers of the 90s, what is the crime here exactly? How is cheating crime, right? It's obviously not like murder or assault. Is it fraud? Like wire fraud or some shit? The most common analogy I hear, I read, is theft. So Davis makes that analogy, and a bunch of others do. I won't do this whole surgical operation on another paper like I did here for Davis's paper. But on this note, I do want to look at a different paper really quick. It's called Crime in the Classroom and Economic Analysis of Undergraduate Cheating Behavior. It's by three authors, Douglas Bunn and two others. So yeah, Crime in the Classroom. That's the title. So okay, cheating is literally crime. Okay, so it even says, quote, it is easy to draw an analogy between cheating in the classroom and the crime of theft. So yeah, there it is. There it is. Later it goes, in the classroom, in the classroom, the professor, proctors, and fellow students act much like policemen, ready to apprehend violators. The cheating student is the criminal, taking information from illegal sources, end quote. So beside the fact that, in nowhere in the paper is there any introspection about how problematic it is to just straight up call students criminals and teachers policemen and their fellow students policemen, right? All that's ridiculous and fucked up. What I want to show is the last half of this sentence: taking information from illegal sources. Okay, so first of all, that isn't theft, right? That would be like a totally different crime, like insider trading or some shit. Which I mean, that's not a perfect analogy at all either. And but think about it, not to get too far away from, not to digress too much, but think about it. So the information itself isn't illegal according to this sentence. It's the source. So we can infer too that they would also say that the way that they got the information is also illegal. Why? Why would that be illegal? Let's do our own analogy here. Let's take drugs, for example. So depending on which drug you're talking about, it can be legal or illegal. So like fentanyl, to take a topical example, right? Fentanyl is legal to obtain as medication. You can get patches, which I think is the form of fentanyl most people are aware of. And they're even these lozenge lollipop things. You just press them against the inside of your cheek and you suck on it. It's really wild. And once you have it, it wouldn't be that hard to abuse it, right? Again, the abuse of those patches are probably the way most people are familiar with it. So that's totally legal, right? Getting that fentanyl in that way and then doing what you want with it to yourself, that's totally legal. But it's illegal to buy it off the street from some undercover DEA agent, right? So the fent isn't illegal. Having it isn't really illegal as long as it's in the right form. And whether you abuse it or not, that's also not illegal. So it's the mechanism of getting it that's illegal. So the specific way you got it could be illegal or not. So it's a construct. An external construct makes it illegal, right? Because nothing changes about yourself or the fentanyl based on how you got the fentanyl. And if you're inclined to think socially and systemically, right, you might wonder why, right? Like, why do those legal constructs exist? Or do they actually work in terms of accomplishing what they set out to do? Are those constructs sensible and logical? Why would someone in the first place want to buy fentanyl? Why is fentanyl something that needs to be bought in the first place? Why is it a commodity, whether in cash or through insurance if you're getting it as medication? So, and a bunch of other questions, right? You could just keep asking questions. But like, what all those questions have in common is they're all social questions, because the illegality of fentanyl is a social question. Really, it's not a question of the fucking integrity of the person who has the fentanyl, or the integrity of the fucking fentanyl itself. So let's bring this back. Cheating is punishable because an external construct exists that deems it punishable. The information isn't illegal. Knowing it isn't illegal, but the way you came to that knowledge is illegal, is cheating, right? A university construct makes it so, in the same way that a legal construct makes certain mechanisms of obtaining fentanyl illegal. And so why does that construct exist? And if we were really to investigate it, we would have to include that it exists in order to compel students to take tests and write essays the right way, quote unquote. And the reason we make them take tests and write essays in the first place is because they need a good grade in the class. And for the most part, starting to change now, but for the most part still, that's how we measure quote unquote successful learning. And the reason why students need good grades is, for all sorts of shitty reasons, right? And also because like no student gets any choice in deciding whether this is the way they want to learn or be judged, right? That's all been decided before they even enter the class. So any test, any essay, like any class really, is a completely arbitrary and compulsory obstacle that stands in the way of the students being able to decide what they want to do with their own time. And any test, any essay, any class is imposed on them at the threat of punishment. So like all that in the name of quote unquote successful learning, right? Which we measure through grades, which, we all know how ridiculous that is. So what can you say to all that except like, fuck off, right? Fuck school. For real. It's such a mountain of horseshit, really. It's a gigantic mountain of horse manure that every student is made to just climb and climb and climb until one day they either get tired and they just sit where they're at, or they find themselves on top of the shit mountain. That's all it is. That's all school is, really. But back to a different point. Back to the article, right? So later in the Crime in the Classroom article, the authors there do try to cogently explain why cheating is theft. Even though the authors themselves, they say it isn't really. Just a direct quote here says it. Quote, unlike the watch stolen from its owner, answers on exams are not taken from the owner, but only copied. The victim still has the answers. The cheating student is free riding on the answers of others, end quote. Okay, so like, that's still not theft, but whatever. Here's how they eventually fucking explain it. From the quote, from the professor's point of view, the free writing being done by the cheater is a serious problem. The professor's goal is to produce knowledge, but knowledge will be underproduced in the presence of free writing. Students who successfully cheat can enjoy the benefits of high grades without actually studying and learning the material. Measures to prevent cheating reduce this free writing behavior. So yeah, there's the free writing thing, first of all. Like, free writing. Even in, like, the literature of today, I don't see rhetoric like that. That's such fucking 90's discourse. Especially, like, again, you're racializing the students, you're calling them criminals, all that kind of stuff. That is such welfare discourse speak, right? Like that goes all the way back to Reagan in like the 80s. Just fucking awful framing, just awful word choice, whatever. But like if you're conscientious, that should all strike you as immediately just loathsome. But let's look more closely though at the way they use produce in terms of like what that implies. To zoom out a bit, theft in the end, like under capitalism, is taking capital. It's taking property without going through the proper capital exchange. You know, you're depriving someone of some means of production or some means of consumption. So you didn't pay or work for it or give them something in return at all. You know, excluding here in this discussion is like personal property, right? So like your fucking shirt or a fucking watch, right? So like I'm just gonna say right now, knowledge is not personal property, okay? I'm just gonna categorically deny that right there. But let's go further. So the knowledge that the teacher is exchanging in the class, I mean, you can already see how fucking ridiculous this sounds. It's so silly. Is that knowledge is that teacher's private property? It's their capital. Or let's steel man this analogy and say it's more like a service, right? So their capacity to teach the class and have the student learn something is their capital that they are exchanging. Okay. Exchanging for what? Right? The student obviously isn't paying them, like not directly anyway. Are they being exchanged for good grades? So the students that failed didn't get a good service, or those that passed but not as well as they expected, like would we say that they didn't get a good service? But then part of that is also like their own fault if they don't meet expectations, right? Which, if it's a capital exchange, like it's a consumer producer relationship, like would we then say that, you know, for example, a person who hires a carpet cleaner to clean their living room carpet, but like those cleaners can't get it completely clean, is part of that the person who hired them's fault, right? Like is it the consumer's fault? And if you can think it is, like what should happen then? Should they pay more to the cleaners? You know what I mean? Like what should happen there? So you can see that it's so muddled that's not a great analogy. It can't be the actual grades that's being exchanged here. So the authors of this article put it as, quote, without actually studying and learning the material. Right. So the obvious objection to that is that, what they mean by that is like what's being exchanged is the act of studying and learning the material, right? So the objection I would have to that is that not every student is equally capable of actually studying and learning the material, you know, no matter how good the teacher is, for all sorts of reasons, right? We don't have to get into that there. But like, if we were to change this formulation and say that they need to put in an honest effort to exchange for the benefits of a high grade, we have to assume a lot of tenuous things, right? We have to assume that the teacher, first of all, is even capable of quantifying honest effort into a good grade. Very questionable. Without bias, literally impossible. And also fraught with invitations to be racist and sexist and etc. And the teacher has to do all that at fair market value, which, like, what would that even fucking mean in terms of like the value, the value of an A in a class, right? What is the fair market value of an A? You know, just again, like I said at the beginning of this section here, not every student is equally capable. It would be like, you know, you have a marketplace where the teacher is selling their shit, and like you have the students come in. Every student comes in with different amounts of money because, you know, their conditions are different. And then like the teacher saying, well, you know, I grade fairly because I'm selling my product at the same price to everybody. So this class isn't biased against anybody. Everyone's being sold the same thing at the same price, which is, you know, that's not like that's not the problem. The problem is not every student is equally capable of reaching that price, right? So very silly, very stupid. And even if the analogy made sense, it still wouldn't be a fair exchange, and there would be all sorts of incentives to cheat, to steal in that sort of marketplace analogy, right? And like just with like the criminal thing, analogizing cheaters to criminals. So there is no introspection at all about how problematic it is to frame the student-teacher relationship as a capital relationship, a consumer relationship, however you want to call it. So not only is the student a criminal and the teacher a cop and the university a justice system, the student is also a consumer who buys the product of the teacher, who is like, I don't know, what the fuck, who, I guess the closest thing they'd be would be like an artisan vendor or some shit, and the university is the marketplace. Like, like what the fuck? Like, you see how nonsense you think like what kind of nonsense you have to think about once you start taking this academic dishonesty shit seriously. Like, you see what a completely deleterious attitude you have to have towards real learning and real education in order to take this shit seriously. Like, everything, like, honestly, I'm just listening to myself talk. It all sounds so ridiculous. Reading these articles, they sound so silly. And none of this has anything to do with like real education or really being a really good teacher. It's just this obsession with catching the crook and giving the students their fair market value. It's so ridiculous. And this type of fucking rhetoric is everywhere in the 90s. It's not just these two papers. It was everywhere in the decades before too. It was one of those things that everyone just sort of assumes about when they talk about this shit. It's like, it's like thinking rich people deserve their money, or that socialism doesn't work because the Soviet Union like fell and disintegrated or whatever. And it's a bunch of received ideas and quote unquote knowledge that have no real logical or empirical basis. So that's it for part 1. I'll be uploading part 2. Should be only 2 parts, honestly. I really went wild with like how much I wanted to say. But yeah, that's the end of part 1 of Cheating in the 90s. Part 2 to be released pretty soon, within the next week or so. Keep on the lookout for that. Thanks again, and I'll see you later.